Well, today my guest is Professor Josef Mahoney, who is a professor of politics and international relations at the China Eastern University in Shanghai. Professor Mahoney has been in China for the past couple of decades or thereabouts and has been researching a number of areas that I think are going to be of considerable interest and importance going forward. And they are the following three main things. The first one is work that he's been doing on technology and where he's introduced the idea of China as a technology society. The second area touches on a much bigger topic of civilizations and particularly China's proposals around a global civilization initiative. And lastly, of course, is the hot topic of democracy itself and how we can approach the subject. Welcome to the show, Joseph. It's great to see you again.
Thank you, Warwick. It's a pleasure to be here. And just a note for your listeners, because you were probably translating the name of my university from Chinese. In English, we normally call it East China Normal University, Wadong Shifan Dashui, here in Shanghai. And I've been here since yeah, and so I've been here since 2010. And prior to this, I lived in other places. But thanks for having me, and I look forward to the topics.
Look, I guess let's dive in, particularly, and perhaps we can start with the question of technology. The situation globally, of course, has revolved around discussions of the high-tech competition between the United States and China. But in some of your work, you've actually added, I think, a very interesting perspective to how we think about China and technology, not just through the lens of geopolitics, but about how technology has become a part of the social and economic fabric of Chinese society. Perhaps you could just elaborate a little bit on some of your thinking in that area.
Well, there's a strong theoretical foundation that offers some insights that I think we can find when we, for those, and I don't want to slip into, a lot of pedantic academic discourse, but there is a critical tradition that talks about how the very concept of what it means to be human is transformed in the modern period. And these discourses originate to some extent with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, but one could trace them back a little bit further to others. Normally, we point a finger at Descartes, not as someone who's critically aware of this transformation, but who is in some way an example of it. And then, of course, the work of Immanuel Kant, which will provide a point of reaction for Hegel and Marx. So there's this idea that something transforms in human society sometime during the modern period. We can date it probably, I would date it at least to the return of Aristotle to European thought through the works of Aquinas in the 13th century and how that sparks the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment and the scientific and industrial revolutions. And along the way, of course, we have the emerging logics and practices associated with capitalism, nationalism, imperialism, which are still operational today in today's world. But these were, of course, things that fundamentally transformed human civilization, completely rewriting the very idea of what it means to be human. And it gave birth to concepts like human rights, but also the universalism that we see associated with Western narratives connected to the rights and dignity of man, so forth and so on. All of these were, in some respects, positive developments, but of course they also had their dark sides, because it's during that period, during the rise of the Industrial Revolution, that we also, as we've already mentioned, see the rise of capitalism, of systems based on exploitation and dispossession, the logics of primitive accumulation through colonialism and imperialism. And then, of course, this brings its ugly head to Asia. Japan radically transforms itself to survive this new Western model. and China, of course, struggles to do so in the wake of the Opium Wars. Um, Now, the point is, whether we take a normative view of this transformation or not, whether we acknowledge um, that these changes were, on the whole, positive for mankind or inevitable, uh, these points are not really of interest to me because they are simply what happened, and why they happened is of interest, but whether or not they should have happened is not of interest to me. But there are people who spend quite a bit of time thinking about that. In 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 some of the critical theory that we see post war France, people like Michel Foucault, for example, who are writing in the Nietzschean tradition, they are remarking on precisely this idea of modern man as something that has he wouldn't use this word because this would be the word associated with his predecessors who he doesn't like, but it's an inauthentic um, state of being. Which this would be an existential term which Foucault wouldn't like. But Foucault would point to things like the industrial model of education, um, the way that we produce people, the way that similar to the way that we produce products, and the way that we reduce them through the market and through capitalism and through nationalism to fulfill objectives that have very little with realizing even the most fundamental qualities of self-care and human care. Now, that's a long debate, but I'm saying that's kind of the theoretical starting point, though, of course, my fundamental orientation is Marxist. So one of the things that, as a Marxist, that I would be focused on is something that comes from Mao Zedong, the concept of the primary contradiction. So, if in the Marxist method of historical or dialectical historical materialism, we look for contradictions and where these contradictions have intersected and where they become factors in producing change, right? And for Mao and the Communist Party of China, what they tend to do is look for primary contradictions so that they can prioritize what they need to focus on. So we have a lot of problems. We have a lot of issues that we need to take care of, but what is the most important issue that we need to address? Now, maybe by addressing that issue, we will begin to resolve some other problems, but what's the primary contradiction? And every 5 years, the party articulates to this day what the primary contradiction is and how they will then use that as a focal point for their development or reform objectives. Now, when I take that principle and I apply it to modern history, the history of modern China, but certainly the history of China's intersection with the West, I go back to what is sometimes called the Needham paradox or the Needham puzzle, which is Joseph Needham's old question of why didn't China accelerate and develop its own industrial revolution or scientific revolution ahead of the West, because it had that capacity. It had a lot of the foundations that should have allowed that to happen. And I'm not going to entertain why. I'm not going to try to answer that question. I've answered that question in other publications, and it requires a lot of speculation and argument, and it's probably due to a lot of different factors. But nevertheless, for whatever reason, China didn't develop that way. I think I know why, but nevertheless, but Europe did, and so Europe was able to move ahead rapidly with the development of technology, to accelerate technological development, and then leverage that against China, starting with the Opium Wars and thereafter. And China was unable to compete. So in one paper, I wrote about how China was a highly technical society, but not a technological society. And to differentiate this, for example, I would say we could look at the idea of li, or ritual. When Confucius in the Book of Rites, or the Li Ji, is talking about the importance of finding the right rituals and practicing the right rituals of statecraft, but also the right rituals in terms of how you take care of yourself, and then how you relate to your family, and then how you serve the state, and vice versa. What he's really talking about is, the techniques of good governance, self-governance, social governance, so forth and so on. So technique is something like, we can say, well, it's it's your iPhone, or it's a specific type of technology. But if we open it into the view of social sciences, it's also how you organize yourself and organize society, right? So there's perhaps a little bit of a oversimplification of categories here, but I give the example of in one of the papers that I write, that China was a very, very technical society, but not, and in some ways had this very robust capacity to build a modern state. Even Fukuyama acknowledges that perhaps the Qing dynasty was, in some sense, the first modern state, or the proto modern state that is then built upon by the Han dynasty and the Tang dynasty and thereafter. But I give the example of the Europeans who visited the Ming court, and these were led by religious, I think they were Jesuits, among others. But nevertheless, they came to the court, and they brought with them examples that were meant to show European strengths, right? And at that time, most of what China had was far superior to what Europe had. But the one area where Europe was more technically proficient was in painting, but painting in a realistic fashion, right? So the Europeans had developed these ways to paint portraits and to paint other images that looked like real life. And the Europeans brought this with them to showcase and to try to impress the court. And the court invited Chinese artists and Chinese scholars in to view these pictures. And they acknowledged the technical capacity, but they argued that it was not art, right? And they gave several reasons why it wasn't art. One reason is that these images were trying to depict real life, trying to depict some form of truth. But of course, these religious visitors, they brought with them pictures depicting religious scenes, right? And the Chinese did not believe those religious scenes, right? In other words, this was European propaganda to support their church and their beliefs. And so the Chinese response was, if art is supposed to show us the truth, then what you have actually shown us is a lie. The second reason they didn't like it was because the purpose of art in their mind was not to reproduce reality. You could look at reality and see the truth of reality as it presented to you. Rather, the purpose of art was to reveal something that you might not otherwise see. So if you look, for example, in some of the brush paintings of fish, right, and these are trying to capture a certain type of flow or movement that is revealing something to you about motion and the art of the fish that might not be readily apparent to you if you're simply looking at a fish, right? So the purpose of art is to reveal the truth that might otherwise be somewhat obscured when you're looking at reality. And the third problem that they had was when they got close and looked really, got up, because, you know, with art, you're supposed to, European art, you're supposed to stand back, right? But when they got close and looked and they saw all the thousands of little brush strokes, it horrified them, because every stroke in Chinese art was significant. You know, if we're talking about calligraphy, or even the stroke of, you know, drawing the horse or the fish. And so it was, in some sense, an abomination. So this is to say, in other words, that they recognized the technical achievement, but they were unable to value it for these reasons, for these qualitative reasons. But it also illustrates that the Chinese themselves were highly technical and had an appreciation of technical capacities. And indeed, anyone who studied Chinese language and tried to master writing characters understands how far technique went. And if we again connect this and extend it to the concept of ritual, we can see that it played a very profound role. Now, the problem is that the West was able to move ahead very quickly with the scientific and industrial revolutions to produce these technologies, as I've already mentioned, that allowed them to jump ahead, whereas China lagged behind and was unable to compete. Now, when we study nationalism, the fundamental, and keeping in mind that nationalism is a modern development, right? We've long had states, we've long had kingdoms or civilizations, but when we use this term nation in contemporary discourse, we mean something that begins to emerge in Europe at a specific or relatively specific point of time. For example, we might associate it with Dante's use of vernacular in the Divine Comedy. But most scholars would point specifically to England. The scholar Leah Greenfeld, who I don't agree with all of her work or even all of this particular book, but she did write a very good book on nationalism, and at least the first chapter, I think, is quite good, called England, God's Firstborn, right? And so England becomes the first modern nation state, according to many scholars, and I concur with this. But what is it? What is the real transformative moment? What is it? What is that essential aspect where England is becoming a modern nation state? And it's where the peasants are being what Marx would call socialized, right? They're being brought into the cities and transformed from peasants into citizens, and where they begin to link their fate with the fate of the nation. And this is what allows, once you start adding to this industrialization and modern governance, this is what allows a country like the UK to leverage itself up, right? If you get everyone, or most of everyone, moving in the same direction and invested in the same narrative and invested in the same outcomes, more or less, then you're able to assert yourself in a way that outcompetes the older feudal models, where most of the peasants weren't part of a mass politics and were difficult to mobilize and were often ignored, and generally didn't care very much who was in charge, right? Their life was subsistence from one regime to the next.
They just paid
so this
rent.
is what, huh?
They just paid the rent.
They paid the rent. That's true. So in any event, you know, this becomes a globally transformative event, because this English model quickly demonstrates, quickly within the scope of history, that it's a superior competitive model. And symbolically, this is we point to the defeat of the Spanish Armada. It starts during Henry VIII, but it is showing its power with Elizabeth I, because the Spanish were this reinvigorated feudal model that the church had invested in to try to protect itself against these developments that were happening in Europe. So then Spanish feudalism is sort of the end point of the feudal experience, or demonstrates the limits of the feudal experience in Europe. And then you either become like England or you become ruled by England. And so then the rest of these countries in Europe, they begin to emulate. And this is what starts this mad rush of going out and conquering the rest of the world.
In that process, the idea of what it means to be human became tightly articulated with technology in a very particular sense too, didn't it? I guess I'm just trying to flesh out how that transformation of the peasant into an urban industrial worker, if you will, was part and parcel of a broader reconfiguration or an emergence of a new configuration of a relationship to technology, and through technology a relationship to the world itself.
Well, in this case, so I would step further than Foucault and look at the French philosopher Jacques Ellul and the German philosopher, who unfortunately was also a Nazi, Martin Heidegger. Yeah, where they talk about technological society and the rise of technological society as a phenomenon that takes place or is initiated in the West, and they see it as a horrifying thing. But in the case, in terms of their critiques, their description, and again, I think this is a little romantic and simplistic, but I think it helps illustrate the point to some extent. They say that the term techna, which is an old Greek term, means tool, right? And that in the ancient concept of tools, man creates tools to serve man. But in a modern technological society, man is created as a tool to serve tools. So this is what Heidegger in a later work would describe as the problem of becoming inframed in a technological nightmare, where you normalize working like a factory worker. You normalize consuming this type of food, this food laden with preservatives and chemicals, and you normalize buying products, watching television, whatever it is that you do in the modern life. So this would be where Marx, in a very separate way, would be talking about the problem of alienation in the Nietzschean. So just to be clear, in the 19th century, there are two basic critical theoretical traditions. One is the Nietzschean, the other is the Marxian. And in the post-Marxist discourse, we generally stand on the side of Marx, and we try to learn lessons that were generated from the Nietzschean critical analysis. And Foucault here can be helpful, because Foucault starts off as a Marxist, but then is revolted by the PCF and the PCF support for the Soviet Union. And he believes that Marxism becomes a restrictive discourse and is therefore unable to really discuss critically things. And so then he says, okay, I'm going to step away from it and go into a Nietzschean way of thinking to try to find new breakthroughs. So then other Marxists will later come back to Foucault and say, okay, what can we learn from Foucault to strengthen our own way of thinking? And generally, I think that would describe what we call the post-Marxist tradition, where there's a critical turn within Marxism, not against Marxism, but within, where we begin to think about some of the things that maybe we got wrong. But nevertheless, so this idea that man has in some way been reduced to a tool, that the concept of man and human being is merely that of a tool. this becomes a concern. Now, certainly in that critical tradition associated with Ellul and Heidegger and even Foucault and others. But nevertheless,
could I just add one thing there? The
yeah.
idea of being a tool, of course, their response is to say we really need to go back to the foothills of the Black Forest and really become villagers again, in a sense. I know that I'm caricaturizing a little bit there, but there is a tendency for a nostalgia, isn't there, when this line of critique of technology is run out?
Well, there is that discourse that you're describing, we might say, is associated today with certain strands of post-humanism,
Yeah.
or the post-human, we should rather say. But actually, in Ellul, there's this Ellul is religious, and he wants to return to some sort of traditionalism. Heidegger is concerned about the Volk, about the people, but at the same time, I think there are two comments to make here about this problem from the German perspective. The first is Nietzsche believes that most people are inadequate. This is most people are susceptible to what he calls a slave morality because they lack the capacity to be greater. And but he says now we live in this society, so he associates modern industrial society with the triumph of slave morality. And he says, if you want to break out of slave morality, you have to become the Übermensch, right? You have to become the overman. And it's normally translated in English as the Superman, but overman is a better translation. And you have to overcome this sickness of being human. And here he's taking, interestingly, a little bit of an insight from his former teacher Schopenhauer, who was influenced by Buddhism, right? In other words, how do you overcome the nonsense of your life? And what's interesting is that Heidegger will be taking a page. He will plagiarize that page, but he'll take a page from the Japanese thinker Kakuzo Okakura, and will criticize what he identifies as the cogito subjectivity of the West, a very radical ego subjectivity, and will specifically plagiarize Okakura's description of Eastern conceptions of being. Okakura calls it being in the world, and then Heidegger will take that line straight into being in time. Yeah. And then funnily, Heidegger's dissertation, his own supervisor,
Husserl
would because Husserl introduced Okakura's student to Heidegger. He knew where the influence came from. When Husserl read Being in Time, he accused Heidegger of backsliding into sort of an Eastern primitivism. So he knew where it was coming from. But the thing with to clarify here, Nietzsche doesn't want to save everyone. He doesn't think everyone can be saved. He's talking about, there's some select few, some elites who can transcend or rise above or overcome. And then, of course, we see this influence playing out in thinkers like Leo Strauss. And you like to talk a lot about the neocons. The neocons of the Bush administration, there were 23 Straussians in that administration, and they were largely responsible for the travesty known as the War of Iraq. But this idea that from Strauss, that you should use the elites should manipulate the political system so that the masses think that they have democracy, that they think that they have power, but but um, but they don't. And in any
It,
event,
it's the
um,
it's like the idea of you know, in Heideggerian terms, I guess it's the fact that that man is fallen, or you know, I'd use it more colloquially and say most people are a bunch of sheep because that suits our regimented way of approaching daily life. The odd ones can momentarily step out of that and step above that. But the trick of the trade is to make the sheep think that they're in charge.
yeah, that's part of it, right? So the to cycle back, there is this very dark moment because Hannah Arendt, who really tries to, as a Jewish intellectual and someone who's very, very popular in the United States. She's dead, of course, now, but she's still treated as a hero among Western and especially American intellectuals. She tries to rehabilitate Heidegger
Mm.
and becomes responsible for making sure that his works are translated and introduced in the United States. And really tries to convince everyone that he wasn't really a Nazi. Of course, she had an extramarital affair with him, and some people say, and I think she maybe encouraged this narrative in some respects that her extramarital affair with Heidegger had infuriated his wife, and because he was dependent on his wife, and she was a Nazi, that she became a Nazi because she was angry with Arendt, and then Heidegger had to follow along with it. So he's just, he's in some way a victim. And of course, I think whoever feels this way or who believes this nonsense are really falling into the trap of valuing Arendt's
But this question of
sexual
technology
liaison.
go away, will it?
Yeah, I'm going to come back to it. But the thing about Heidegger is that, of course, we had the publication of his diaries, the Black Notebooks,
Yeah.
where he says, it's fitting that the Jews are being killed by industrial methods because they're the ones who unleash this madness on the modern world, and he will justify being part of the Nazi regime because he says, we must. He's terrified of the East. The West had negotiated the rise of technological society and had these resistance, it had emerged over a longer period of time in contest with other values, the church, tradition, and so forth and so on. But in the East, they had to transform so quickly in order to survive the immediate Western onslaught, Japan being the clear example, that they effectively abandoned their tradition. And this absolutely horrifies Heidegger, right? And so he sees a future where the Oriental is going to come back, okay? And then because there was nothing to slow them down, they're going to become highly technological. And then Europe, which is trying to preserve some notion of humanity against the technological society that they themselves created, will be unable to survive. So then this is one of the reasons, this is the sort of the dark logic of Heidegger getting into bed with the Nazis, because we need to create this fortress Europe against the Soviets, which he also identifies as an Oriental, against Marxism, because Marx is a Jew and therefore an Oriental, right? And against what's coming from Japan, and who knows, maybe China at some point. So this is all part of what's going on there. But to go back to the earlier point, my observation is that the primary contradiction that existed between China and the West was the profound gap that existed in terms of their respective development as technological societies, right? And technological society, again, because Europe had technology, but they had also reorganized their societies in ways that they could use that technology and outcompete other countries. And China, until the Communist Revolution, remains essentially a feudal country. The vast majority of its people still living in subsistence farming.
So it's a forces of production problem. Forces of production problem.
It's a forces of production problem, to be sure. Although we can say that the peasant, the Chinese peasant, in some ways is quite different from the European peasant. Whether we ascribe this to what they call Asiatic despotism or some other discussion, let's not go down that path. But the point that I want to make is from the 19th century onward into the 20th century, the fundamental contradiction that has to be resolved is this profound gap, this profound technology gap. And it's not just who has the most advanced machine or industrial system or AI or computer chip. It's also how society is organized and works together with government and technology to solve complicated problems, right? So this is where I begin to develop the idea of technology and technological society and to differentiate them. And the argument that I make is that the United States is still number one in terms of technology, still number one in terms of military capabilities, but not number one in terms of industrial system, right? And there are a lot of other economic indicators where they're no longer number one. But the example that I make in this paper that was published a year and a half ago in the Journal of Chinese Political Science is that as we can see demonstrated during the pandemic, right? China was able to address and solve better than anyone else a very complicated problem because they had the governmental organization, they had a government that had been cleaned up through an anti-corruption campaign. It was ready for action. They had technology that was sufficient, right? In other words, they didn't necessarily have RNA vaccines, but they were able to build and develop vaccines using an older technology that in some ways were better than the RNA vaccines. In other words, we've seen research to indicate, of course, that the Chinese vaccine was much cheaper to produce. It was much easier to transport. You didn't have to keep it at super cold temperatures, much easier to inject. The technology was a lot more reliable. You didn't have the same sort of concerns associated with whether or not we would see adverse reactions with this new type of technology, therefore more social trust. But also, we found that whereas you were more likely to have a more serious illness associated with COVID if you got the Chinese vaccine, you were less likely to die. So in the RNA vaccines, you were more likely to die than the Chinese vaccine, but less likely to have serious illness. So those who, that's the strange little paradox. So in any event, the point is, China was able to mobilize, they were able to address a problem, and indeed address a problem that started here, the best we can tell. Maybe it started somewhere else, I don't know, right? Maybe we only know that it started here because the Chinese were aware of what was happening and were able to recognize something. But it starts here, or at least we become firstly aware of it in China. They absorb that initial hit, warn the rest of the world. The rest of the world has some time to mobilize, fails to mobilize. China recovers from that initial hit. All of society is moving in the direction of solving this problem with, the apps that we have on our phone and various controls. Before the vaccines are ready, it's really the social controls that are saving people. China stands up and in 2020 and 2021 saves the world economy.
Yeah.
Not only saves the economy in economic terms, but is producing the things that people actually need to survive, right? Meanwhile, what does the United States do? It collapses. It uses dog whistle tactics to blame China, right? And it increases the money supply by 20%. This is the start of global inflation. It's not the war in Ukraine, right? It's increasing the money supply by 20% when you have the supranational currency to paper over the tremendous losses that you have due to your failure in governance. And what's really remarkable is that if you go back and look at the science, they knew that a coronavirus outbreak was coming. This is not conspiracy. There were predictions, there were models saying that we would have a coronavirus outbreak in 2020, and it was called disease X. Okay, this is why in October 2019, before we know what's happening with COVID, the CDC finalized an emergency response plan to a coronavirus outbreak, right? They knew something was coming. How did they know it was coming? Because coronavirus outbreaks, COVID was the fourth one, appear to be correlated with climate change. As we continue to see the climate changing, it's creating these stimuli that are accelerating the mutation of viruses, and among these, coronaviruses are some of the most sensitive, right? So we had models, and this is another reason it's said why Moderna was so far ahead of others in developing a vaccine, because the pharmaceutical companies saw this coming, right? And they were dealing with the question, and this illustrates the point in part. The question is, why didn't Trump use the CDC plan? And the answer is, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't work. You have 50 states, you have blue states, you have red states, you have different capacities. You have a lot of people who don't like vaccines at all. You have a lot of people who don't trust science, who don't trust the government, right? How are you going to actualize a national plan when you can't even fix the bridges and the roads, right? How can you do that? And keeping in mind that public health power is based on police power. And there's, if you tried to do something in Florida versus New York, you're going to get tied up in the courts. They knew it wouldn't work. They knew it. So instead, they put all of their hope in accelerating the development of vaccine. All right. So what this demonstrates is China then is showing that it has, in fact, in some ways, surpassed the United States as a technological society. If we can compare how
it requires, or it brings to my mind, Joseph, this idea, and it goes back to your earlier remarks about what it is to be human and the kinds of human beings that, in a sense, exist in these different societies or civilizations that make possible the types of responses or limit the types of responses that you're describing.
Well, so this is where we come back to something that's different in the Chinese experience. And I think that it's really, in some ways, central to what we're seeing from the Chinese government today about trying to differentiate China's development path, its development goals, but also its civilizational values, right? In other words, that on the one hand, China was compelled to emulate this Western model to a large extent in order to survive the onslaught of the West. And it was compelled to accumulate capital and technology, not only to compete, and we're now in a very intense period, or a period of growing intensity with respect to great power competition, But also in Marxism, Marx says whether we like it or not, we're in the period of capitalism. Capitalism is something that accelerates the development of technology, and let's take that as a positive, but realize that at some point we're going to need to use those technology stocks in order to solve the problem of capitalism itself and to establish socialism, right? So one of the interesting things about Chinese Marxism is the extent to which Marxism was cynicized, and the fact that it could be so easily cynicized because it had values that were consistent with traditional values. Now, not uniformly, there were quite a bit of differences, but you can find this very strong idea of socialism and even communism in the work of Confucius, for example, where he's talking about the Datong, or Great Harmony Society, and he talks about the necessity of establishing a well-ordered society, a Shaokong society, which in today's Chinese discourse is translated as a moderately prosperous society, which is a threshold society for then moving to a higher order of contradictions that will allow you to resolve those other problems that are preventing you from reaching your full development potential. But this is to say that within Marxism, but specifically within Chinese Marxism, the Chinese tradition and the Chinese concept of being was not completely negated. And it's now being slowly recovered and expanded. So, for example, we see this incredible emphasis on green innovation and green development. Why? Why? Well, on the one hand, because the United States suppressed the development of this technology for a long time, and this was a competitive opportunity for China. Okay. Two, because if we look at most international studies on the matter, China, in terms of capital and numbers of people at risk, is the most vulnerable country to climate change, right? China is not energy independent the way Russia or the United States or Saudi Arabia are. And it needs to move to green energy in order to survive, right? And as they are doing this, they are going back to, so we've heard President Xi going back and saying, we need to ensure that the Taoist principle of fostering harmony between man and nature is one of our central values, right?
There's almost, can I just interrupt? It almost in that is a turning on its head or addressing the fear that Heidegger kind of described, the idea that technology would render the humanity subservient, and through technology render nature calculable as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. Whereas here, by bringing in the Taoist traditions, it's almost like saying, look, technology is a part and parcel of modernity, if you will, but we can't let it dominate us, number one, and we must use it to not render nature calculable in a brutal sense, but to enable us to establish a relationship of flow.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear. We're in a very complicated moment, right? And what we're talking about are narratives and awareness, but we haven't actually found the solution or the breakthrough point, right? I mean, we're still in the early days of trying to foster these types of solutions. And if you're aware of what China is doing in terms of not just green innovation and green development, but cleaning up the rivers and the lakes, and the trying to protect the farmland, trying to learn key lessons from the terraces in Yunnan and Hunan, because 25% of their food is coming from these things. and they have shown themselves for thousands of years to be highly resistant to climate change. Or we see what they're doing in terms of building green oases around green high-tech industries as is emerging in Hefei now. So there are some things that they're doing in addition to China.
Earlier you talked about the Chinese court's reaction to Western art as, in a sense, technically proficient, but not really art. What you're describing, to me anyway, sounds like, again, an articulation of art as a way of thinking about possibilities, revealing the world in other ways, as opposed to merely trying to create a simulation of it. And this sensibility that's washing through a lot of this, in some senses, draws on that artistic disposition, if you will, to bring.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with that. But what I would say is there was a period when China was experiencing rapid growth and development, and I don't say that. And Xi Jinping makes a sort of an interesting comment, and it sort of begs the question about whether or not the party was itself uncertain about its path, right? But one of the things that Xi Jinping makes clear is that the party is now confident in its path, right? It knows what it is doing, why it is doing it, where it is going, and what it needs to avoid doing. Now, this understanding, as I understand it, is drawn from two sources. First, their own positive experiences with development and the way they were able to develop without resorting to all of the nasty things that the West did to achieve development, but also because they are observing in real time the failure of the Western model, and likewise, the consequences of the Western model, which China was compelled to join to some extent, in terms of climate change and unending conflict, right? So, in other words, China has become confident in its way because the Western way leads to disaster, and our way has more promise for the future. But to go back to your earlier point about Heidegger, yes, Heidegger was grossly mistaken on many accounts. But what's interesting is if we go back to what he should have learned from Okakura, right, was this concept of being in the world. The mistake he makes, again, many mistakes, and one of them I think is a certain type of Western hubris, where he can never imagine that the Asian would be capable of solving a problem that the West was unable to solve for itself, because he is fundamentally a racist and complicit in a genocidal regime. But if we read that book where Okakura introduces this point, the Book of Tea, Okakura is answering the question, what's the fundamental difference between the East and the West? And he says, well, you need to understand Lao Tzu and Daoism, plus you need to understand Zen Buddhism, right? Now, I'm not going to go into a long lecture about why you need to understand those things. But then he says, okay, basically, we have a different concept of being in the world. But then he says, in fact, this difference no longer exists. Okay. In other words, he's speaking from the experience of Japan. Japan has essentially become a Western nation.
Yeah.
And whatever remains of its tradition is just a superficial thing. The emperor will use tradition to encourage young men to fly their planes into American warships, but that's just as modern and industrial as Osama bin Laden using the Quran to inspire young men to fly their airplanes into buildings in the United States. It's the same logic. In fact, there are some people who argue that bin Laden is a signal of a new type of modern thinking emerging in the Arab world. I'm not going to get into that. It's a contentious topic, but I'm not sure that I really agree with it. But nevertheless, but the difference is China was able to preserve something of their culture in terms of how they were able to adapt Marxism. Because in Marxism,
there was a time where some of that was described as feudal vestiges, but
well,
just as well
specifically, there are 2 points, right? There are 2 points. The first is when Li Dajiao was leading the Marxist study group at the old library at Peking University, the first thing, or one of the first things that he notices is Marxist dialectic. And he goes, oh, this relates to, or it can be related to yin-yang thought. Okay. And what's really exceptional about Chinese civilization is expressed in many respects by yin-yang thought, which is an articulation of a very fundamentally different way of thinking, orientation of thinking, whereas it's based on the principle of harmony, or the principle of and, whereas in the West, it's the principle of either or. Fundamentally, what we generally describe as Aristotle's law of non-contradiction. So the Western logic is predicated on the law of non-contradiction, and Western Eastern Chinese thought is based on the unity of opposites, completely opposite values, right? Starting points, ontologies, or epistemological foundations. But in any event, so when they're looking at Marxism, what they see is a way of thinking that can be cynicized, but can also be used to strengthen Chinese ways of thinking, so that China would be able to compete with the rest of the world without completely losing itself the way Japan did. And bear in mind, they were very familiar with what had happened in Japan, because a lot of those young men had gone to Japan to study that model to try to figure out if Japan had the solution for China. So this is where Heidegger makes the mistake. He's drawing his observation from the Japanese experience, whereas China will in some way, through socialism, through the Marxist dialectic, be able to preserve, to some extent, this idea of being that we might otherwise describe as being in the world. And that's being strengthened now, and they're trying to return to this in some sort of way, through concepts like a shared future for humanity, the Global Civilization Initiative, and so on.